Hello, Tom LaVecchia here with the New Theory podcast. We have a legend on the show today. We have Ann Wilson. You probably know her from the rock band Heart. Ann Wilson, welcome to the New Theory podcast. How are you doing today?
Well, hi, I'm fine. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. And, you are a legend. We'd like to start off our podcast to get to know our guests. The first is if you wouldn't mind sharing your formative years, kind of where you grew up and what kind of made you you.
Not too much of a general question or anything.
It is a loaded question, but answer how you see fit.
Yeah. No, that's cool. I'm Ann Wilson. I was born in the 20th century in 1950, and my father was a military officer. We moved all around. I have two sisters. In the late 60s, my younger sister Nancy and I started learning how to play guitar. We started doing folk groups, and then because I was older, I went off and got into bands in school, and eventually in college I moved up to Vancouver, BC with a guy that I was seeing at the time, and we started a band called Heart. Nancy, maybe about 5 years later, joined the band up in Vancouver, and we made our first record called Dreamboat Annie up there. When the Vietnam War was over, we came back down to the States and started doing shows down here and making records down in the States, in Seattle. And we have, up until last year, Heart was active as a touring performing entity all over the world. And this year, I decided to take I'm doing my own solo thing apart from Heart. My sister is doing her own solo thing apart from Heart. So far, all this year, I've been touring my solo thing, which is being called Ann Wilson Apart. And I'll be touring with the solo thing all the way up to the beginning of November.
Wow. Okay. So you just totally downplayed a legendary career, and I like your humbleness. I'm a child of the 80s. I remember you. I was a huge fan. I was still a huge fan of yours. My family is a huge fan of yours. So when did you know, obviously you can sing beautifully, but when did you know music was for you? What point in your life?
I think probably when I was about 13.
Okay.
Just the stuff that was being played on the radio back then, really, it hit me differently than most other kids in my school. I mean, they all really liked it, and they liked to dance to it and all that kind of stuff, but for me it was almost like church. And so I got a guitar and started learning how to recreate it, and it was just a compulsion.
Nice. And I always say it takes 17 years to be an overnight success, where I know you worked hard and then you obviously got huge, but you paid your dues and then you guys exploded. That's before social media, before, Facebook, before Instagram, Snapchat, etc. So you guys got big kind of during a different era. So were you discovered? Was it more of a grind and a slowly gradual, increase? How did Heart become Heart, which frankly, in most circles in music industry, especially legendary circles, is a household name? So what was that affliction point or that combustion point where you guys really exploded?
Well, back in the late 70s, which is when Heart came to be known, as you said, there was no social media. There weren't even any cell phones. We didn't even have, there was telex back then. That's how you got information back and forth. And so it was necessary to drive places and go places and show up and talk to radio guys and actually physically be there. So, yeah, it was a total grind. In fact, I got to say that even up to today, being in a successful music situation is a complete grind with high points with really super high sublime moments, but most of it is really super hard work and showing
True.
out.
True, and you make a great point because I mean, obviously nowadays it's not saying it is kind of easier in a way, but you can't just go on social media, do a post, and reach your millions of fans. Back then, you had to physically go out, touch, feel, and taste your fans by physically going, and I think it's even harder back then, to get big, and you guys grinded it out. And I do have a question though, and I Googled, obviously, I check you out on YouTube and huge fan of yours. But one performance that really stood out was a Kennedy Center performance for Led Zeppelin in 2012 where, you brought them to tears. I mean, that had to have been a surreal moment. If it's okay, can you walk us through that? Because I am in awe of that. And if you could just share or shed some light on that experience.
Yeah, that year they were doing a tribute to Led Zeppelin as they were being inducted into being given the Kennedy Center honor, along with a few other people, Dustin Hoffman and a few others, Buddy Guy, I can't remember who else. But so they put together a tribute to Led Zeppelin. It was a few other bands, several other bands, and then us. And they asked us to do Stairway to Heaven. So
wow,
that was kind of the culminating song of the tribute. And they presented it with a stage band and a small choir and then a huge choir. And then us. So 4 different entities all appearing as the song developed, So it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it just ends on this huge, the whole first world is on stage, that's the
wow.
song. And it was an amazing arrangement of that song, and our job that night was to please the guys in Led Zeppelin, and it seems from the way it looked that they were mighty pleased.
Oh, and that's to say the least. Now, one thing I really like, many things about you, right? But one thing I really like also is, although you late 70s, 80s, it's not 2017. You're not only still around, but you're still relevant. So how are you connecting with millennials and kind of younger listeners? Because you do hear circles of millennials still talking about your music, and this is their parents, maybe even some of their grandparents' music. So how do you stay relevant, and how do you connect with kind of the younger generations?
Well, I think that a lot of, especially millennials and younger people too, are they are inspired by some of the, as they call, classic rock, because it came from a much simpler time when people were not quite as imaged. They weren't imaged at all. They hadn't been, yelped out. It was completely just people with a message trying to put it across. And the good lyrics, about universal things. And I think the thing that has helped us stay in front of different generations' eyes is just the authenticity of it and the simplicity of the approach, passion and honesty,
Well, it's interesting because in the social media environment, and I've done a lot of social media consulting, and a lot of social media consultants say, hey, we really need you to we need you to look authentic. Well, you know what? If you are authentic, it shows, and I think that's also prevalent in your staying power. Just a few more questions before we wrap up. One thing that comes to mind is, obviously there's a business aspect of this. There's commerciality. Otherwise, how do you survive? So what are some of your tips maybe? Because you have a lot of entrepreneurs, especially millennial entrepreneurs who listen to the show. And you are an entrepreneur. You may be a musician, you may be an artist, but you're also an entrepreneur. So what kind of entrepreneurial tips or business tips do you have to highlight your sustainability for our younger listeners?
Oh, I think that the main one is always think outside the box. If you're not out in front, then you're being reactive. And
Sure.
if you're paying attention to reviews of other people's stuff and acting accordingly, or copying what some other company has done, then you're reactive. And to be a really successful and truly authentic business or entity, you have to be out in front. You have to be outside the box. And you have to not be afraid of risk. And you have to know when to fold it, you know.
True. Now, what would you highlight as your biggest, it could be personal, professional, whatever you're comfortable sharing, what would you highlight as your biggest success to date?
Biggest success? Well, I would count success not in dollars or in numbers. I would count it in the satisfaction of the people listening, and in my own satisfaction with what's happening, in the connection we can feel together, and that it's absolutely real and very close every single night. I think that's success. Now, if the money comes along with it and the big numbers, then that is icing on the cake, you know. That's the perfect world right there. But
true. I'm sorry, keep going.
Hello?
No, yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off. Keep going out because I was like writing some notes. I was about to jump in, but so it's that connection with the fans. What's your biggest failure to date, or your maybe biggest misstep to date, whatever you're comfortable sharing?
Well, I think the biggest misstep I ever made was partying too much. Was back in 1986 when Heart had their first #1 records, and all of a sudden, you know, everyone's telling you how brilliant you are and how miraculous it all is. You know, believing the hype and just going, well, yeah, I guess I am miraculous, yeah, and partying and just, you know, sort of floating around on this dreamy bubble of being #1 in the country, when I should have been out there thinking, okay, what's next? You know, what do we do now that's going to top this, or what are we going to do now that's going to actually be productive?
That's amazing because you do, you know, success is tricky because sometimes you get success and it's, you know, you work hard for it, but when it comes in droves, and then you're right. Sometimes you believe on hype and you kind of get lost in it. So before we wrap up, who does Heart listen to? I don't know if you're on an iPod these days or, you know, old school or however you listen to music, but who does Heart, you know, who does Ann Wilson listen to?
I listen to a pretty eclectic mix. I listen to some Americana. I love listening to Williams. I've got Dead Can Dance on there. I've got Muse on there. I've got Robbie Robertson and just a whole range. I like world music really a lot because it's so outside of any trend or any American push to be the right image of music. It's just so real.
Nice, and it does seem that, judging by your answer, you do have an eclectic mix. So, in kind of conclusion, are there any modern day singers that you think are up and coming, that you admire, maybe that are fans of yours that reached out, that you're like, hey, who's this person? Meanwhile, they turn out to be huge. Who's kind of some of the modern day performers that you respect and admire, if there's any?
Excuse me for a second.
No worries.
Yeah, we're out in the cornfields. I have a little hay fever. I think that Matt Bellamy is one of the most talented people to come along in a long time. He's not exactly. They've been around for some years, but that band is always on point, and they're just completely pushing. They never say. They always say something with message. They're not just pussyfooting around, True, and again, about keeping it genuine is just going to persevere, especially in the social media environment where it's easy to kind of get the message out. So let's go through your dates. You got some big dates coming up. I think tonight you're playing in Ohio, and then what I'll do is I'll put a link
in the podcast to your next states, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, to be swinging our way over to New Jersey on the 18th. So we're going to send either myself or some representatives from New Theory to be there. So we're going to hear you live, and we're excited about that. So any parting words? Yeah, any parting words? Because, I mean, this is, candidly, I wish I had another 3 hours, but unfortunately, you got to get on stage. So what are some of your parting thoughts? When you're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and you say your speech, who are you going to thank?
I think in that speech I gave that night, I thanked the fans, the listeners, a lot, because they're the ones who actually bring it, who make it happen. But I think I just roughly thanked all the support team, and the theater of the music business for providing that opportunity, to get my voice heard.
That's awesome. And folks, listen, there's a lot of learnings here. This is a podcast that you got to listen more than once. You have a talent that has exploded, has been around since the 70s, still continues to tour, is on her first tour by herself. And if it's okay, one last question. You've always been accustomed to touring in a larger group, and now you're solo. How's that transition? Did it come natural, or is it a little kind of old butterflies that pop back up?
Oh, well, at the beginning of each leg of the tour, I usually feel a little bit, a little bit nervous, like, wow, can I still pull this out? And then with luck and perseverance, I usually do. I never take myself for granted. I always have to I have to urge myself along.
I love it. I love it.
I don't want to just phone it in,
True. And like I said, you're still on the grind. You're still reaching your fans. I see that you're actually fairly active on social media, have a nice following, so we'll be sure to tag all that. And Ann, thank you so much for joining the New Theory podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been great talking to you.
It was our pleasure. Enjoy your day, and we'll see you in New Jersey. Be well.
Okay, same to you. Bye-bye.